Good afternoon, and thanks everybody being here live for the talk today with the artist Ming Wong and also Haegue, and then entitled Informal Comparison. I'm Venus Lau, and I'm from Ullens Center for Contemporary Art. So today we have Ming, a Singaporean artist based in Singapore and also Berlin, working with performance, videos, and also other types of image production too. And his recent works are being shown in Shanghai Biennial at the moment. And Haegue works with sculptures, videos, and not with a lot of everyday objects and craftsmanship stuff. And then her and having a show being in Liam Museum in Seoul at the moment. So I think we should just start with something more general. So Haegue, is it on? So a lot of the core of your practice is your sculptural practice, and a lot of them actually involves movement, either physical movements in the interaction with the audience, but also movements that are internalized in the sculptures, like the ballet, dance, sculpture, and the sonic figures. Would you talk more on these sculptures in your practice?
Hello. Sculptures. I think I had a tendency to portray a figure through my sculptures. And I think when I started the so-called light sculptures, what you see right now on the images, that was the time that it became more obvious and even conscious to me that my sculptures have something anthropomorphic. And I think in general, maybe both for Ming and me, it's interesting to think about, what remains abstract and what seems to becoming a human, but then again, based on the maybe questioning what humane means. We are living in a time and era that the human central thinking is very much in doubt. So furthermore, I think thinking about the human, what is humane and what is the figuration of the humane still remains something to define. And however, going back to a little bit of sculpture making, as you see, I think the way how I worked around the time of 2006 and 2009 were using actually object to portray a quality of a figure. So there is a kind of contrast or a hybridity between the thing and a figure. And this tension is, of course, was very attractive to me, that I work with immediate material from the market, item, commodity, what you could purchase, and using them as they are, that without really deforming so much, but it was more about the arrangement. And at the time of this bigger sculptural group, what has resulted as a warrior believer lover at exhibition at Bregenz, it became more like group, bigger collective dance of those individual figurations. And for the first time, I worked with the music piece, which is called the Sacre de Printemps, The Rite of Spring, the composition by the Igor Stravinsky, and the choreography was done another Russian avant-garde colleague of him, the Nijinsky. And the motivation of using the music piece was for me very simple, that it is a very well-known piece and we kind of know the melody and all, but all of a sudden it was for me the moment of rediscovery of the dance and movement behind this music piece, which was somehow deleted in my head, and this rediscovery of the movement of the very eclectic and on the base of the distonal music piece was almost shocking to me. And this very the detour of the avant-gardist through the primitivism also interests me, that they were not the musician from the center of the Western avant-garde. You know, they were actually rather from the marginalized region, the Russia. I mean, they were avant-gardists, but at the same time they were marginalized avant-gardists. And why they, I mean, instead of bringing their own traditions, such as, you know, Russian folk music, they were working with the American native primitive rituals, such as the rite of the spring, you know, celebrating the spring by sacrificing someone. And all this came together to conceive the group of sculptures. And this was the result, that 3 times per day, like as a church bell, there was a music, and then without animate the sculpture physically, they were animated through this, let's say, hybrid quality of the cultural references from Russian avant-garde to the everyday object and etc. That the entire floor get animated.
Yeah. It is interesting that you brought up the element of primitivism, because it is actually a little bit subtle, but also like pretty obvious in a lot of your works. Just as like primitivism, the history like of the legacy of primitivism is like how we kind of imagine a pre-language blank page, and then how we use it to think about modernism and what modernity is, or what the present is. So Ming, a very large like body of your works are moving images, like films, and then also like video and all that. And then, those are like temporal. On one hand, those are like temporal sculptures, and also I know that you're actually working on your recent research on science fiction in China, and also the modernization of Cantonese opera. So on one hand is the archaeology of the future, and on the other hand is like how the history of like modernization of historical figures, because in Cantonese opera they're all like historical figures. There's no contemporary people inside. So is this like a different type of like interesting temporality that can be compared to maybe the primitivism in Haegue's works? And can you like tell us more about like your research on these two like interesting temporal positions?
Okay, I'm gonna try. Yeah.
Okay.
My background originally is I have a history in theater when I was growing up in Singapore. So things pertaining to performance and the stage, and the lights are very bright. So actually, I went to buy something this morning, and it's actually from Korea. Yeah. This is actually the latest things that like Korean aunties wear to protect themselves from sunlight. Yeah. And I think this is what I need in order to actually face you and talk to you about what I'm doing. I've been in Hong Kong on and off for the last year, and I've been looking at the history of Cantonese cinema, and in particular Cantonese opera cinema. Because the early cinema in Hong Kong and in China was, they had opera troupes who already had actors and stories and audiences, and then they just started making movies, and they made a lot of movies. They also performed in California because there were a lot of overseas Cantonese immigrant groups, and so they brought the technology from Hollywood back to Hong Kong. And there was this wonderful period of time in the 30s and 40s when the technology of the day influenced the traditions of Cantonese opera, which is derived from Chinese opera, one of the oldest performing arts forms in the world. And so, you had a happy marriage of East and West, old and new. They introduced like storylines from Hollywood. They had Chinese operas in Western dress. they introduced the violin, saxophone, banjo, and popular tunes of the day, and absorbed all of that into Cantonese opera. And so I thought, can I use something as old as Cantonese opera, as Chinese opera, to look at notions of the future? Because if you go to a Cantonese opera performance today, it's 80% old ladies who are watching it. And so I decided to look into what notions of the future means, and especially from this part of the world. And that started my interest in science fiction studies. And so for the last few months, it's really a journey into science fiction in the Chinese-speaking world, science fiction in China, or really it was the lack of so-called what we know as science fiction, because of course that was very much something that comes from the West. I mean, the golden era of science fiction, English language science fiction, is from America in the 50s. And in China, it was kind of like, it has a very interesting history. It was actually great thinkers of China, like Liang Qichao and Lu Xun, the kind of like the great writer of China, who introduced science fiction to China by translating the works of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne into Chinese in the early part of the 20th century. And they thought that science fiction actually was a way to, it could be a wake-up call to the country to kind of like modernize the society. But because of the events of history and politics, the genre of science fiction had been suppressed several times. And it wasn't until the 90s that science fiction kind of grew again and kept growing today to a point where now you have the first bestseller work of fiction in mainstream fiction, which is a work of science fiction by Liu Cixin, and that only had its first English translation that came out last November. This is how recent things are. And also this growth of science fiction also coincided with of China sending astronauts to the moon. And so I'm was trying to find ways of connecting Chinese opera and the development of science fiction in China. And it seems very far-fetched, but I've kind of picked out strands that have developed, and I'm kind of putting that in my recent work.
Thank you, Ming. It's so weird that I don't know if you're looking at me or not, so I just try to turn to another side. Actually, yeah, it's interesting when you bring up the science fiction history in China, which is also like the history of science fiction is also the history of how people like explore their ability to imagine the future. In China, like this is not okay. Like although like the genre of science fiction is actually like getting bigger and bigger, like in China as a form of literature, especially with like Liu Cixin's Three Bodies problem that is like now translated into English, and people are really into that in the West. But at the same time, like we are like, I mean, China is also a country that bans time travel on TV because you are not allowed to think about the alternative timelines. Like, what if this didn't happen, or what will the future be? So, yeah, the science fiction, like your whole research on that actually shows a mishmash of like different types of possibility of like what ifs, like different types of multiverse that we can imagine at our present position. So Haegue, I know that like in your new solo show in Liam in Seoul, you actually show a lot of like you show a new body of works that are like, made of hay that looks like very primitive, looks very totemic, but at the same time they are synthetic. They are like industrial material. Like, would you tell us like more about like how and why you started working with these material and forms?
I'm trying to find the right images to show you. Yeah, here we go. So this is the installation build what Venus was talking about. So we are talking about the time mode, right? So the show was titled "Shooting an Elephant and Shooting the Elephant, Thinking the Elephant." The elephant was the motive of that exhibition, which, and especially I was using the Chinese character of the elephant, which was made after the appearance of the elephant. But since the elephant was not existing in most Chinese speaking countries, the Chinese character were used, that they were actually made the character of elephant out of the bones of the elephant. So there is an idea of the abstraction and then imagining the figure of this animal which doesn't live in that region, but it still has something to do with the figuration of something that has existed. In one hand, with the metaphor of the elephant, I was referring to on literature, The Shooting an Elephant, the short story by George Orwell, based on his own experience in Burma, where he served the British police officer, that there was a call that an elephant got violent and has killed the people and damaged the houses, so he had to go to the site and deal with the situation, meaning like shooting him and like punishing the elephant. But however, when he arrived, the elephant, which is very typical for the animal elephant, which is very, very unpredictable animal, the elephant was again like came into his normality and was not crazy anymore. But however, the Orwell, as a colonial officer, felt a huge pressure that everybody gathered there, the Burmese natives, expected the violence towards the elephant that he had to shoot. And the book actually the short story described this very short moment of shooting and the pain of the elephant in a very intense way, that we could feel the agonizing process of the colonizer, who is also under the pressure and not to judge things with his free will. There is no idea about the autonomy. And so somehow I was working with this metaphor of elephant, which is very post-colonial metaphor, but also, as you said, it has something to do with the idea of the civilization and folk, so something very ancient, what we call like the origin, like which lies back in our history. But at the same time, by using the synthetic imitation of the straw, so what you see, the old architecture and the sculpture of them are not the organic straw, but the synthetic straw. So it's a pure imitation of it. I also came back to the way how I work usually with the industrially manufactured material. And in general, I think not only the straw sculpture, but also in general, in the way how I work, how I fabricate the material, there is a strong interest in what I call the anachronism. It's what maybe that's what also Ming has referring to. There is a different time mode, like coexisting, and then resist the idea of the ordering the time. Like resisting in a sense that for me it's maybe something political, but at the same time something very philosophical, what we can usually find in the Taoism, how they measure and perceive the time and the space. That once I used the exhibition title borrowed from the Taoism called the art and technique of folding the land. what we know as a teleportation, which is often also described in the science fiction as the mode of moving oneself within the space, is that you teleport yourself and then you reappear in completely different place, like within a second, like in immeasurable short amount of time. And that mode of the movement and the mode of the time is, I found actually in Taoism, that is reappearing in science fiction, what Ming was introducing as a kind of the signature of the modern time. You know, all this thinking, I think, is reappearing and disappearing through the fold of the time. That is what I summing up like as an anachronistic appearance. And here, I think I'm making a confession here that through thinking in that way of anachronistic weaving of the time and space, I got stuck into the, again, very basic fundamental questioning as a sculptor between the realism and the abstraction. And I was considered for a long time the someone who worked with an abstract language. And as you see here, there are the architectures and the figures that they are escaping, but also reminding us of something that we know. And this is, for instance, the Islamic temple in Russia called the Lala Tulips, the modern architecture. This is made after the Mayan architecture, the pyramid. And those figures were rather, like abstract, like started with the simple geometries, but also diverted from the geometry, and more this became like descriptive. But still, like they are very anthropomorphic, like vertical, and comparable to our body. And there is another figuration, like on a flat mode on the wall, that I worked a lot with paper collage, and all of a sudden there is now the composition appearing behind the collage that forms a kind of, something hovering in the air, and we don't know whether this figure is now coming down or going up. But it's something very ghosty and pleasant at the same time. And there are, for me, like this one really shows the abstraction and the figuration at the same time with such a strong primary color. And but the motive behind is again something similar, like animalistic, and something similar quality like the elephant, which was a lion dance. It's like, again, we are coming back to the movement of dance, like ritualistic dance. So I titled this piece as a lion dance, again, like assuming that lion dance, which is very widespread, common, traditional form of folk dance in most of the Asian countries, from Southeast Asia to Far East Asia. However, lion doesn't exist in the region, so people have to imagine how this animal moves and make the dance based on this imaginary movement. And therefore, the lion dance became a kind of very powerful tool for the ritual, assuming that the dancer becomes more than what he or she usually is in reality. And the power of the imagination and the lack of the presence, and assuming the authority that you haven't seen, it is for me our agonization with the realism and the figuration, maybe. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Yeah, the anachronism like idea and how you use the imagery like of the movement of like weaving the time It's very interesting. It's just like how we weave the time, like not only on a flat or linear way, but also it can be like in any form, like in any form spatially. Never really think about animals when you think about science fiction thing. I mean, because when Haegue was talking about anachronism, and of course, like on one hand, like we are at the art fair, we travel a lot, we go to the airport a lot. Of course, we know about like non-plays, and now I think that there's like like temporal non-plays too, because when we look at a lot of Hollywood science fiction movies or like a lot of movies about the future, now I think we more and more like we lose the ability to think about future that's really far. Because when you look at the science fiction back in maybe the 60s or 70s, like what they're imagining is like so far from what we are. But when you watch movies like Her, basically the future is shot in the Shanghai in present. So like, I know that you are shooting a new movie in Shanghai, like based on the French Nouvelle Classic. So can you tell us more about this kind of like temporal non-plays of like with maybe China is the future or something like that?
Yeah, I'll come to the work in Shanghai in a minute. But I wanted to pick up also on what Haegue was saying about this kind of like this notion of kind of this kind of porous time, and like the work that I'm showing in Shanghai Biennale, which actually is a direct kind of like result of my recent research. You have it's like a space station. It's like ground control, like when the people on Earth are talking to the astronauts. It's like 24 screens, and across these bank of screens, I kind of put a lot of the things that I have found in the last several months of research that pertains to what science fiction is or can be, and how that relates to something more ancient, like Chinese opera. So, for example, there's a news segment of Liu Yang, who is the first woman from China, the first female Chinese astronaut to be sent to space. And she says when she was up there in space, she dreamt of the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, floating in the clouds. And this is a very intelligent woman. And, and that's significant. And next to that screen, you'll see 1968 Shaw Brothers movie of Chang'e, the goddess of the moon. And below that, somewhere, is a clip from the film Gravity with Sandra Bullock, where she has to escape back to Earth in a Chinese spaceship. Except when she tries to read the controls, it's all in Chinese, and she says "No habla chino." And next to that is a clip from a 70s cult movie from Taiwan, Guan Gong Fights the Aliens. And so there's this kind of very strong kind of connection to mythology. When you start to think what is science fiction in China, and then towards the end of the 20th century, when there was a new wave that's still happening, a lot of the science fiction actually feels like it's dystopian descriptions of the present, where so-called science fiction has caught up with the present. And so what is there in the future? So when I was installing in Shanghai, I had a look around the city, and of course I knew that Shanghai is now, it had always been a cinematic city, and now it's like a very popular destination for shooting science fiction movies, like Her, for example. And I walked around the French concession, and I was very struck by the levels of time that you could see when you're just walking around. When you're in a French concession, which is where a lot of the European apartments and villas are located. Every time you turn a corner, you'll find you're not sure if you're in Paris, if you're in China, if you're in the future, in the past, or if you're in the poor slum dwelling, or if you're in the domain of the rich. And some of the architecture, which used to be like private European villas, are now housing over 20 families, and over time they try to kind of adapt change the living environment. So when you start to read the kind of like visual clues. I find it really rich. And so for the new project that I am going to shoot next month for the show in UCCA, I'm actually going to do a work inspired by French New Wave, Nouvelle Vague cinema, shot in the French concession. In particular, I'm drawing on this iconic film called Last Year in Marienbad from the 60s, which was one of the first kind of iconic art films that dealt with cutting time and place in a cinematic language. But instead of talking about last year, I'm kind of like projecting it into the future. So certain lines, certain references were all going to be conjugated in French to the future. So not last year in Marienbad, but next year. Next year in Marienbad.
Yes, you talk about like so this movie will be like an important part of your exhibition at UCCA in Beijing in June, and Haegue's solos, which is like part of the solo exhibition trilogy of you and also Haegue and also Curator Aruna Nanchai, who's unfortunately not here. When we actually like plan this trilogy of solos, and we expect people like will ask us questions like, why do you put 3 Asian artists who are very active in the international world together? Because I think now we are in the time that we think that we are international when time and space and a lot of cultural differences are flattened by globalization. But at the same time, I see the works in 3 of you like there is still some space for like to discuss or explore the identity tensions, but maybe not with like the old like traditional ways of like talking about gender, using a lot of like cultural stereotypes, so with something that is very universal, like banal objects, Venetian blinds, light bulbs, denim, and also your case is more interesting because that involves world cinema and also the objecthood of languages, because you speak a lot of languages in your film that you actually don't speak in real life. So I'm interested in how like you guys actually think about the identity issues like as an artist when you're working. Especially like Haegue, you were in the exhibition at MUCA last year. That is like a great show curated by Nefhak, who's giving a talk, like a panel, hosting a panel here like after us and after hours. And then so I'm interested to listen to like what is your thoughts about like identity, because it's not like a simple thing about this like Orientalist is like subordinated by Eurocentric discourses. Like it's like what you mentioned. When you talk about your elephant metaphor, you mentioned Orwell's like shooting elephant movie, which is kind of like based on his own experience of living in Burma, being in between the people's like the local people's resentment to the British rule, and also like him being kind of struggling in this like being in this like colonial position. So I would love you guys to share like your thoughts about this identity. What is like the work of like creating identity as an artist like, in your practice?
No, I mean, it's not that the question is unclear. It's just a very difficult question. Maybe again, maybe going back to the anachronism a little bit, because identity as a word has an origin of identifying. There is something that I could identify with, meaning that there is an idea or a region or things outside of me that could be synchronized with me, that I could find myself again, right? And I mean, if I could, I'm someone who would like to work with that I could not yet embrace with, and that's the maybe the non-synchronized, I mean the living with something that is non-synchronized with myself, and something anachrotic, something non-synchron. Maybe those are the terms that that I would like to bring up as a method of thinking, maybe not method of making. And that's maybe also the reading of how I see my immediate environment and our time where we live our life in. And but the word sounds pretty and makes sense, but actually the more I struggle to live with authority, I feel more stronger violence of the ignorance. I truly believe I'm definitely international, but like rather internationally lost than internationally grounded. There is no notion of groundedness, and I don't know, too depressing. But acknowledging what is maybe tough or confusing is maybe the courage I would like to obtain or maintain. Identity for me difficult, like politically, like geographically. There are this drive of the categorization, while we are suffering from what I mentioned before, the violence of the ignorance, which is very contradicting each other. And as an individual, I feel often helpless. What can I do so much as an individual? So therefore, I'm imagining a lot who I can ally with, like this imaginary notion of the other who are mostly unknown. I mean, even if the dear friend, dear colleague who I have such a strong trust and belief in, when we are meeting at the opening, that's not the moment that I could really project my belief and trust in. I think we all need a kind of momentum, but also those momentums are often taking place like unexpected time that is less, exposed to our social life, and but then again, I'm keep imagining the belief in the power of imagination of the other under the circumstance of the ignorance of the other, maybe.
And Ming?
I think the ignorance and insecurity actually, I choose rather to use it as a kind of weapon or a kind of thing. I'm trying to make it as a kind of positive struggle because I'm born. I grew up as a third generation Chinese Singaporean, and there's nothing much there to fall back on. You can say it's secure or great. And I've worked with this word identity in my work for so long that now I try to avoid actually the word, because it gets, as you accumulate experience, it gets more complex, which is a good thing. And currently, I'm taking a lot of joy in exploring notions of what science fiction and future is, and what an alien identity could be. Not like alien, like a greenhorn thing from another planet, but more like Tarkovsky's Solaris, where it's a breakdown in mutual perception or communication. It's a never-ending sea of changes, it's the realization that something else is working on a totally different level of consciousness. And I kind of take solace in that. And yeah.
Thank you. That's very inspiring, especially when you talk about the sea thing, because every time, like most of the time when we talk about like identities, it's always about that position that you are overdetermined by other factors and tensions and relations. And yeah, this is like very I wonder how many minutes do we still have? It's like, is that 5 just now?
Oh,
We have
10 minutes at least.
Do we have 10 or 5? 5? Is it 10? Okay. Are there any questions or feedback or comments?
I have a fantasy of doing a collaboration with Haegue as a moving a sculpture and with notions of being an elephant in the room. You know, I haven't seen the show in Korea, but that notion of the lion, and I'm come from Singapore, which is named after a lion. It's Lion City, and it's not native to Singapore. So my whole entire kind of existence is based on a myth, and so maybe it's actually a good thing that somehow we are connected through this project at UCCA, where it offers a kind of another possibility of what?
Of a lot of things.
of positing a kind of notion of identity, what the Asian artists working today.
Yeah, I think so too, because I originally when I put together 3 of you, co-creator, you and also Haegue. I mean, I think it's an interesting point to look at how Chinese artists position themselves, because a lot of young Chinese artists they are pretty reluctant to admit they are Chinese artists, because I mean, I think for some reason they're some burden from the last older generation with a lot of that presents a lot of glossy Mao Zedong and a lot of cultural stereotypes that a lot of young artists would like to pull away from that. And on the other hand, of course, the internet, the sheer fabric of information with other artists in the world actually contribute to this situation that a lot of artists would be, international artists. Of course, on one hand, it's very pragmatic. It means you're successful if you are recognized as an international artist. And on the other hand, it's a lot of artists, Chinese artists, are also thinking about, okay, I don't really need this, cultural stereotype if there's no more new narrative about identities are being formed. And I think the practice of 3 of you, although one is absent at the moment, is an interesting way to look at how an artist position him or herself in this crazy art world that is gradually flattened by capital and a lot of common visual languages. Because when I work with a lot of Chinese artists, actually a lot of the works looks like what I saw at Contemporary Art Daily, the art blog. And this very, very interesting way to look at how different artists are connected together in the wormholes of the internet. I don't know, I don't know if you will have the similar thing, because it's also anachronism, wormhole, that is just different parts of the world connected at the same time. But yeah.
I'm also, of course, I'm also very aware that let's say, even if I'm a little bit older than the others, my generation or our generation probably is made our career in a globalized time, that we were much more aware of each other and each other's region, while I guess until 80s, I think Chinese artists didn't know about the Korean artists didn't know about the Singaporean art. It was a very different understanding of each other. And somehow, apart from judging whether this phenomena is good or bad, I'm very aware of this, the consciousness of the region and the regional neighbors, is one of the character of the Asian art today. There are more journals, there are more reviews, and there are more maybe exhibitions to see of each other, which was also very rare. I think Korean institutions tend to not to invite other Asian artists. Like there was a too strong orientation of the towards the Western, which is now like decentralizing. And we are probably also the generation who have to respond to that new tendency for the first time. And I think that makes the interesting dynamic of our generation and our language and production, that the references are coming from each other, and we are always finding the commonness and the distinction at the same time. There is no way not to embrace like both the distinction as well as the commonness, and that make our work very complex, because you cannot simplify it into difference or the commonness. That and I think the same goes for our modern history. We share a lot of the suffering modern history of the war and the dictatorship and the severe industrialization and the modernism and the discontinuation of the tradition and the philosophy. However, the phenomena of those historical development differ from each other. I think that a lot of referencing in our generation's practice somehow referring to our hunger for getting know each other, which is for me like it's a very delightful, because it's what I learned mostly from contemporary art practice, and the artist as a researcher has been tremendous source for me to grow with my knowledge further. And I found a lot of referentialism, which even if there are also the danger of those rich references, I think is one of the interesting characteristic of our generation, and also our languages maybe. Maybe I want to end up maybe my statement with maybe the fact that why we are here like pairing on this panel, which is actually the exhibition at UCCA. For me, it would be my first exhibition in China, the country which used to be more the civilization and the bigger framework of the culture than the nation. In terms of our relationship between Korean Peninsula and the continent, what we call the China. And it's funny that I'm not maybe an exception who reflect the development our region's development, that I was born and educated in Korea, but after the graduation I went abroad, like abroad in that case, or in that time was, of course, the Western country. But there were two worlds, like the new world and the old world. I went to the old continent, Europe. And after 20 years, I'm having the second biggest major exhibition in my home country. And the same year, I will have my first show in China, in Beijing. And I kind of see like what I'm doing kind of as an evidential, not a big exception, but rather as an evidence of what we are experiencing where we are now, and somehow being like atypical for the tendency. I feel also deep responsibility to respond to where we are, but also respond to what we actually have to achieve. Not to only acknowledge. I mean, acknowledging is a very important act for me, because it also requires quite a courage. But at the same time, when you only acknowledge, I think that is too easy, too little. And I'm very looking forward to introduce myself to China, and very delighted to also have an opportunity to conceive a catalog that is often also forgotten, and how important it is to translate and then sharing the the academic knowledge to research into someone's practice through the professional academics, that we are living in such an internet, that's the point, the internet period, that a lot of people think I know the practice, I know the person, even if you never really experienced the actual exhibition or really have read any text. And I somehow am very grateful to have the opportunity of the next exhibition, which offers an actual experience of the witnessing the physicality of the space and work, but also providing the serious research material for the scholar and the professionals in China, where still the scene is a little bit contained through the language barrier, which is very known to me as someone born in 70s in Korea. And I guess that's it.
I think it may be similar experience to you too, because this is also your first Chinese institution show and then.
Yeah, it's been a journey, because when in the early part of my career, I studied and I lived in London, and this was in the early 2000s, and there was also the great kind of like a rise of the Chinese art, and I found myself in a peculiar position because I wasn't Chinese enough at the time. People were looking for artists from mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, but I kind of fell through that, and then I continued doing what I was doing, and then there was on one level a kind of reading of my work of the Asian in the Western world, and because I was living in UK and then in Berlin, where we both are now, and then now recently I've begun to do more projects in Asia. I've had shows in solo shows in Tokyo, and I've been doing things in Hong Kong, and now my first institutional show in China. And so I myself am curious how kind of like the perspective has changed, and how the reading of the work is shifting as well. And it's something that I can't control, and I'm very curious as to how the work would be read in China.
So thank you so much, for you two, for the inspiring dialogue, and thank you, for all of you who came here for the talk, and thank you so much.